All right, settle in, because the story I'm about to tell you is a wild one. It's about a young mother, cast out and left for dead, who walked straight into a secret that got her husband killed. She thought she was running from her past, but she was running right into a trap that had been set for years. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of secrets, lies, and a darkness that hides in plain sight. And it starts on a prairie so cold and empty, it felt like the edge of the world. The wind out on that prairie didn't just blow, it had a mean streak. It clawed at Lydia Mercer's face, pulling at the thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders and seeping into the seams of her worn-out coat. She kept one arm locked tight around her belly, 6 months pregnant and feeling every bit of it, while the other held her daughter Hazel. The little girl was barely a year old and she'd gone quiet. Too quiet. That silence scared Lydia more than the howling wind or the endless, empty land stretching out in every direction. Hazel had stopped crying hours ago, just curled into her mother's shoulder, her little breaths thin and shallow. It was a terrifying stillness. Lydia stumbled to a halt near a small rise, where a few skeletal cottonwood trees leaned against the sky like tired old men. Her knees screamed as she gently lowered Hazel onto the frozen, brittle grass. The mule cart she'd paid for back in Dalton, her last few dollars spent on what she thought was a ticket to a new life, had broken down hours ago. The driver, a shifty-eyed fella who never gave her his name, hadn't offered a single word of apology. He just unhitched his mule, turned around and rode back the way they came, leaving her standing there with a sick child, a baby on the way, and nothing but the cruel, flat horizon. That was noon. The sun was already starting to dip low, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. She was alone. She sank down against the rough bark of a cottonwood, pressing her hands into the small of her back, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. Her feet were swollen and raw. Her heart felt like a stone in her chest. She closed her eyes just for a second, just to catch her breath. And in that second, the memories flooded in. 6 weeks ago, she had a home. A real home, with warm bread cooling on the counter and a little crib set up by the fire. She had a husband, Martin, a good man who worked at the town hall. He'd kiss her hand every single night when he came home, and his voice would fill their small house as he read nursery rhymes to Hazel. Then the sheriff showed up at their door. Then the trial. It was all a blur of angry faces and words she didn't understand. Embezzlement, they called it. A big word for stealing. But Lydia had never seen an extra penny. They hadn't lived large. They were simple folk. A week later, they hanged Martin at sunrise. And just like that, the town she'd called home turned on her. It wasn't just whispers. It was a wall of silence. No one would hire her. No one would meet her eye at church. They didn't call her a widow. They called her the thief's wife. So she'd packed the few things she had left, grabbed Hazel and walked away. She had no destination, just a direction. West. West, where nobody knew her name. Nobody knew her shame. A sudden rustle in the grass jolted her back to the present. Her eyes flew open. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through her. Hazel was gone. "Hazel!" Lydia croaked, her voice raw. She scrambled to her feet, her body screaming, staggering toward the trees. "Baby!" Then she saw her, the little blue bundle of her daughter's coat, crawling toward a shadow at the edge of the tree line. But it wasn't a shadow. It was a man. He was standing perfectly still, tall and imposing, dressed head to toe in buckskin. He had long, dark hair tied back with a leather strap, and a hunter's bow was slung over his shoulder. In one hand, he held a rabbit, dangling limp by its feet, and his other hand, his right hand, was reaching out slowly, deliberately, toward her daughter. "No!" Lydia screamed, a primal sound torn from her throat. She stumbled forward, her legs like lead. "Don't you touch her!" The man didn't even flinch at her shout. He just crouched down, setting the rabbit on the ground beside him, and held out both of his hands, palms open. And then the most impossible thing happened. Hazel, her quiet, sick, little Hazel, giggled. A real happy giggle. She reached out her tiny hand, not for the man's fingers, but for a beaded necklace hanging around his neck. Lydia finally reached them, breathless and terrified, and scooped Hazel into her arms, pulling her tight against her chest. I'm sorry, she gasped, her words tumbling out. She wandered off. I just... I closed my eyes for a second. The man just watched her. His face was like carved stone, impossible to read, his eyes dark and calm. He glanced down at Lydia's swollen belly, then at the shivering child in her arms, then back to her face. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes seemed to see everything. You shouldn't be out here, he said. His voice was low and deep, with an accent she couldn't quite place. It wasn't unkind, but it was direct. There was no pity in it, just a statement of fact. Lydia clutched Hazel tighter, the child's small body feeling impossibly fragile. I don't have anywhere else to be, she whispered, the truth of those words hitting her like a physical blow. They stood there for a long moment, the only sounds the wind whistling through the dry grass and the frantic thumping of Lydia's own heart. The sky was getting darker by the second. Just when she thought he was going to turn and walk away, leaving her to her fate, he spoke again. My camp is near, he said. There's a fire, there's broth. Lydia hesitated. Every story she'd ever been told warned her about strange men in the wilderness. But then she looked down at Hazel, who had started shivering again, a deep, rattling chill. And she felt the gnawing emptiness in her own stomach. She was so cold, so tired. The man didn't wait for her answer. He just turned and started walking, expecting her to follow. Lydia took a deep breath, shifted Hazel's weight on her hip, and did just that. She followed the stranger into the growing darkness. The trail was narrow, winding through thick brush that snagged at her skirt. It wasn't a long walk, but with every step, Lydia's mind raced. Was she a fool? Was she leading her daughter into an even greater danger? But the thought of that warm fire, that hot broth, pushed her onward. The camp was nestled in a small, shallow hollow, protected from the worst of the wind by a rocky ridge. A simple lean-to made of hides and branches stood on one side, and in the center, a fire crackled invitingly in a ring of stones. The smell of wood smoke and roasting meat was the most welcoming thing she had ever smelled in her life. The man gestured toward a log near the fire, and Lydia sank onto it, her legs finally giving out. Hazel had already fallen back asleep in her arms, her little face peaceful in the flickering firelight. The man added a few more pieces of wood to the fire, his movements slow and deliberate, perfectly economical. He moved like a man who was completely at home in this wild place. He stirred a pot hanging over the flames, the savory smell making Lydia's stomach ache with hunger. After a few minutes of complete silence, he finally spoke. My name is Nate, he said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the fire. Nate Lonehawk. Lydia just nodded, pulling her thin shawl tighter. Lydia Mercer, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her then, a quick assessing glance. You come from Dalton, he stated. It wasn't a question. She nodded again. Not by choice. He didn't press her. He didn't ask why a pregnant white woman was wandering the prairie alone with a toddler in the dead of winter. He didn't ask about her husband or her home. Instead, he just ladled some of the steaming broth into a tin cup and handed it to her. The warmth seeped into her frozen fingers, a small miracle. She drank it slowly, savoring every drop, feeling the heat spread through her chest. It tasted of rabbit and wild herbs, and it was the best thing she had ever eaten. When she was done, he took the cup without a word and refilled it. She drank that one too. By the time she was finished, the shaking in her limbs had finally stopped. Hazel snored softly in her arms, a tiny whistling sound. Thank you, Lydia whispered, looking at the man across the fire. She wasn't just thanking him for the food or the warmth. She was thanking him for the silence, for the lack of questions, for not looking at her with pity or judgment. Nate just gave a single, small nod. Then he stood up and walked to the other side of the fire, his back to her, and stood there looking up at the stars that were beginning to pepper the darkening sky. And for the first time since that sheriff had knocked on her door, Lydia didn't feel the crushing need to keep moving, to keep running. She just sat there listening to the crackle of the fire, the sound of her daughter's breathing, and let herself be still. But as she watched the silent man staring at the stars, a new question began to form in her mind. Who was Nate Lonehawk? And why did it feel like he was waiting for something? Lydia woke with a start, the scent of wood smoke and damp earth filling her senses. For a moment, she was completely disoriented. The sky above the hollow was a soft, pale pink, and the air was crisp with the promise of morning. Hazel was still asleep on her chest, a warm, heavy weight. Then she heard the quiet, rhythmic scrape of a knife against wood, and it all came rushing back. Nate was crouched by the fire, which was already burning steadily. He was carving a small piece of wood, his hands moving with a practiced grace that was mesmerizing to watch. Thin ribbons of wood peeled away, falling to the ground around him. He didn't look up, but she knew he was aware of her. "You slept," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That's good." Lydia shifted, wincing as a dozen stiff muscles protested. Sleeping upright on a log while pregnant and holding a toddler was not exactly restful. She stood up slowly, carefully, so as not to wake Hazel. "I think I forgot what that felt like," she admitted, brushing dirt and leaves from her skirt. Nate set aside his knife and the piece of wood he'd been working on. He moved to the fire and offered her a tin cup. "Coffee," he said. "Not strong, but it's warm." She took it gratefully, the heat a welcome shock to her system. The coffee was weak, more like hot brown water, but it was wonderful. Hazel woke up a few minutes later, blinking in the morning light. She didn't cry or fuss. She just looked around the small camp with wide, curious eyes. Nate, without a word, handed her a small, shriveled piece of dried apple. Hazel took it from his large, calloused hand and began to chew on it contentedly. The three of them sat there in a comfortable silence, broken only by the crackling fire and Hazel's soft chewing. In Dalton, silence had always felt heavy with unspoken judgment. Here, it felt different. It felt like a space to breathe. But Lydia's mind was still racing. This man had taken them in without question, but he was a complete stranger. She knew nothing about him, except that he was a skilled hunter and a quiet carver. And for some reason, that made her more nervous than if he'd been loud and demanding. "Do you live here all year?" she asked, breaking the silence. Nate shook his head, his eyes on the horizon. "In summer, I move higher, to the Red Hills." He gestured vaguely to the east. "This hollow is warmer in the winter." The Red Hills. Lydia had heard rumors about that place back in Dalton. Strange stories. Some said it was haunted. Others said it was sacred ground to the natives. "My mother called it sacred land," Nate said, as if reading her mind. "The last place our people gathered before they were driven north." His tone was flat, matter of fact, like he was describing the weather. But there was a deep well of sadness beneath the words. "I'm sorry," Lydia said quietly, not knowing what else to say. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and unflinching. "You didn't push them," he said, "but your people did." She couldn't argue with that. It was the truth. He stood up, brushing the wood shavings from his buckskin pants. "I need to check my traps. There's rabbit left from yesterday if Hazel is hungry." Before he could leave, Lydia spoke up, a sudden urge to prove her worth, to not be a complete burden. "I can cook," she offered, "if you have a pan." Nate paused, considering her for a moment. Then he gave a short nod. "Cast iron pan is by the fire pit." He disappeared into the trees as silently as he had appeared the day before. As soon as he was gone, Lydia let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She felt a strange sense of relief being alone, but also a new, prickling unease. This place, this man, they were a mystery. She found the heavy cast iron pan and got to work, grateful for the simple, familiar task. While she cooked the leftover rabbit, Hazel toddled around the edge of the clearing, picking up leaves and pebbles. Lydia watched her like a hawk, her heart lurching every time the little girl got too close to the woods. By the time Nate returned, carrying two more rabbits, Lydia had a small meal ready. She handed him a plate without a word, and he took it with a slight nod of acknowledgement. They ate in their usual silence. But this time Lydia felt bolder. She had questions, and she needed answers. "Do you have people?" she asked, her voice sounding loud in the quiet hollow. He chewed his food slowly, thoughtfully, before answering. "Farther north," he said. "My cousin's family. I visit them in the spring." Lydia hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Not a wife?" Nate's hands stilled. He set his plate down and looked into the fire, his face a mask. She died, he said, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the flames. 2 winters ago, sickness took her, and our son. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. I'm so sorry, Lydia whispered, her own grief feeling fresh and raw again. Nate just shook his head, his eyes still on the fire. Sorrow is part of the land, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he wouldn't show. We all carry it. Lydia knew he was right. She carried her own sorrow like a physical weight. But as she looked at this quiet, lonely man, she realized his burden was far older and heavier than her own. Later that afternoon, Nate showed her how to reinforce the lean-to with fresh pine branches, packing mud and moss into the gaps to keep out the wind. His instructions were simple and direct. You learn fast, he commented at one point. I have to, she replied. That night, as she rocked a sleeping Hazel by the fire, she watched Nate across the flames. He was carving again, his knife moving with that same steady rhythm. Another small animal was taking shape in his hands. A new thought, sharp and unsettling, pierced through Lydia's exhaustion. This man, Nate, he wasn't just a random hunter she'd stumbled upon, the mule driver abandoning her in this exact spot. Nate appearing just moments after. It was too perfect. It felt less like chance and more like a plan. But whose plan? And was Nate Lonehawk her savior? Or was he something else entirely? Was he the man who was meant to find her? Or was he the man she was meant to be found by? The distinction terrified her. The first snow fell a week later. It wasn't a blizzard, just a light, delicate dusting that coated the hills in a layer of white. But it was a warning. Winter was coming for real. The hollow was becoming more of a home with each passing day. Nate had reinforced the lean-to until it was a small, sturdy cabin, the walls packed thick with mud and pine logs. A proper home, even if no one dared to call it that. Lydia's pregnancy was becoming more difficult. Her back was in constant agony, and the baby, a boy she'd decided to name Luke, was restless. One evening, Hazel was lining up the small wooden animals Nate had carved for her. There was a rabbit, a bear, a bird, and a fox. You've got a whole farm now, Lydia said, trying for a smile. Hazel grinned and pointed to the new, unfinished figure in Nate's hands. That one's for Luke, she declared proudly. Nate looked up from his carving, his eyes meeting Lydia's over the fire. She says his name is Luke, he said quietly. Lydia was taken aback. You told him that? She asked her daughter. Hazel nodded. It was my husband's favorite name, Lydia admitted, her voice thick. I didn't think I'd get to use it. Nate's hands slowed their work. It is a strong name, he said, and she couldn't tell if he was talking about the baby or the man she had lost. Later that night, after Hazel was asleep, Lydia stood outside the small cabin, the cold air biting at her cheeks. Nate came to stand beside her, a silent shadow in the moonlight. You don't have to keep doing all this, she said softly, gesturing to the sturdy shelter. You didn't ask for us to come here. He didn't answer right away, just watched the moon hang over the snow-covered hills. No, he finally agreed, but you came. She turned to face him, needing to understand. Why are you helping me, Nate? Really? He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and heavy with memory. When my son died, he began, I buried him in the Red Hills, on the same ground my father hunted. After that, I made a promise. I would speak to no one. I would carve no more. The world had taken enough from me. He looked at her then, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her. But the world kept turning, and one morning, I heard laughter in the trees. It was your daughter. Lydia's throat tightened. She walked straight into a place she didn't belong, he continued, a strange, sad smile touching his lips for a fleeting moment. And she laughed as if it was already hers. Lydia swallowed hard. She's like her father, she whispered. She always saw the good in things. Over the next few days, the snow got deeper, and Lydia's time grew shorter. The ache in her back became a constant, grinding pain. Then one morning she woke up, and she knew. It's happening, she said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and excitement. Nate, it's time. He didn't panic. He moved with a calm efficiency that soothed her own frayed nerves. He laid fresh hides on her sleeping furs, stoked the fire until it was roaring, and put a pot of water on to boil. He tucked Hazel into a corner with her wooden toys and a piece of jerky, and then he came to Lydia's side. I have done this once before, he said, his hand surprisingly gentle. A long time ago, for my cousin's wife. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and exhaustion. The wind howled outside the cabin, a wild symphony for her labor. Through it all, Nate's calm voice was her anchor. Breathe, Lydia. Push. You are strong. And then, just as she felt she couldn't go on, a new sound pierced the air. A sharp, healthy cry. A baby's cry. Her son's cry. Nate cleaned the baby with practiced hands, wrapped him in a warm cloth, and laid him on Lydia's chest. Luke, she sobbed, tears of pain and joy streaming down her face. Hazel crept closer, her eyes wide with wonder. Nate knelt beside them, and in the firelight, Lydia saw something in his face she'd never seen before. A deep, profound sorrow, mixed with something that looked almost like hope. He placed a newly finished carving next to the baby. It was a perfect, tiny wooden horse. For him, he said. Lydia looked from the baby in her arms to the quiet man who had delivered him, who had saved them all. You're part of this now, she whispered. You know that, right? Nate didn't answer, but he didn't leave. He stayed by the fire all night, a silent guardian watching over the new family that had been born in his lonely hollow. But as Lydia drifted off to sleep, a chilling thought surfaced. If Nate had been waiting for them, if their meeting wasn't an accident, then who had sent him? And were they coming to help? Or to finish the job that started in Dalton? The first sign of trouble came with the thaw. The snow began to melt, turning the hollow into a muddy mess. But it also brought the scent of new life. The world was waking up. Lydia had settled into a quiet rhythm. Her days were filled with caring for Luke, teaching Hazel, and turning their small cabin into a real home. Nate was a constant, steady presence. He taught Hazel the names of birds and showed Lydia which roots were safe to eat. They were a family in all the ways that mattered. They never spoke of it, but it was a truth that had taken root as deep as the pines on the ridge. One afternoon, Nate came back from checking his trap lines, his face grim. Riders, he said, his voice low and urgent. 4 of them. Coming this way. Lydia's blood ran cold. She scooped Luke into her arms and called for Hazel, who ran to hide behind her mother's skirts. By the time the horsemen appeared at the edge of the clearing, Nate was standing in front of the cabin, his bow unstrung but held ready in his hand. Lydia stood beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized one of the men instantly. It was Eli Bell, the former town clerk from Dalton. He looked older, haunted. The man next to him wore a sheriff's badge. The other 2 were strangers with hard, cruel faces that made Lydia's skin crawl. One of them smirked down at her from his horse. Well, well, he drawled. Look what we have here. Playing house with the savage, are we, Mrs. Mercer? The sheriff cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. Lydia Mercer, he said, his voice official. We've come to talk to you. I have nothing to say to any of you, Lydia said, her voice shaking but firm. Eli Bell dismounted, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. Lydia, please, he said, his voice pleading. I came to tell you the truth. Nate didn't move a muscle, but Lydia could feel the tension radiating off him. Speak then, she said. Eli glanced nervously at the other men. Then he took a deep breath. Martin didn't do it, he said, the words rushing out. He didn't steal that money. He was covering for someone. Lydia felt the world tilt on its axis. Who? She breathed. The mayor, Eli said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Mayor Thompson. Martin found his secret ledger. He was skimming money from the railroad contracts. A lot of money. Martin was going to expose him. The smirking man spat on the ground. Your husband was a fool. He should have taken the deal the mayor offered him. A deal? What deal? Lydia's mind was reeling. The mayor threatened my family, Lydia, Eli continued, tears welling in his eyes. He said if I spoke up, my boy would have an accident. I was scared, so I kept quiet. I let them hang an innocent man. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture more horrific than she could have imagined. Her husband wasn't a thief. He was a hero. He had died protecting his family and his honor. But the story wasn't over. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. That's all very touching, Belle, but it's not why we're here. He turned his cold eyes on Lydia. Your husband was a clever man, too clever. Before he died, he told a friend he'd hidden the mayor's real ledger, a little insurance policy. We've torn his house apart, and we've torn this town apart looking for it. And now we're going to tear your new little home apart. Suddenly, it all made sense. The mule driver hadn't just abandoned her. He'd been paid to leave her out here, to die in the wilderness, where she couldn't be found. But the plan had backfired. They had lost her, and now they had found her again. They didn't want justice. They wanted that ledger. The smirking man dismounted, a cruel smile spreading across his face. The mayor sends his regards, he said, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt. He'd like his book back, and he wants to make sure there are no loose ends this time. Nate stepped forward, placing himself between Lydia and the men. He raised his bow, and in a single fluid motion, he knocked an arrow. You are not welcome on this land, he said, his voice as cold and hard as the winter stone. Leave now. The sheriff laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. This isn't your land, Indian. It belongs to the territory. Now step aside before you get hurt. But Nate didn't move. His eyes were locked on the smirking man with the knife. Lydia clutched her children, her mind racing. The ledger. Martin had hidden it. But where? He'd never said a word to her. Or had he? She thought back to those last frantic days before his arrest. He'd been working late every night, poring over maps and documents. And he'd been strangely insistent on one thing. He'd made her promise to take Hazel to the Red Hills if anything ever happened to him. He'd said it was a special place, a safe place. He'd even drawn her a map, a simple, crude drawing on a scrap of paper. She still had it, tucked away in the lining of her coat. The Red Hills. Nate's sacred land, a place Martin had never been. Why would he send her there? Unless the ledger wasn't a book at all, unless it was something else, something hidden in the Red Hills. The smirking man took a step forward, the knife gleaming in the pale light. Last chance, boy, he snarled at Nate. Just as he lunged, a sudden, piercing whistle cut through the air. Everyone froze. The man with the knife looked around, confused. The sheriff drew his pistol, his eyes scanning the trees. Who's there? He yelled. Show yourself! From the trees on the ridge overlooking the hollow, a figure emerged, and then another, and another. Within seconds, the ridge was lined with them. A dozen men, all dressed in buckskin, all armed with bows and arrows, all silent, all watching. Nate's people, his cousin's family. They had come. Nate lowered his bow slightly, a grim smile on his face. I told you to leave, he said, his voice echoing in the sudden, tense silence. This is your last warning. The sheriff and his men were trapped. They were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The smirking man's bravado vanished, replaced by a pasty white fear. Eli Bell looked from the men on the ridge to Lydia, his face a mask of regret and terror. It was a standoff. But Lydia knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And the secret her husband had died to protect was buried somewhere in the hills behind her, waiting to be found. And these men would kill anyone who stood in their way to get it. The tension in the hollow was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The sheriff and his hired thugs were caught, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. Nate's cousins stood like silent statues on the ridge, arrows nocked, ready. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. Then the sheriff slowly, reluctantly, holstered his pistol. He glared at Nate, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. This ain't over, he spat. You hear me? This land will be ours. And you, he sneered, looking at Lydia. You'll get what's coming to you. He and his men turned their horses, riding out of the hollow, with a cloud of threats and curses hanging in the air behind them. Eli Bell lingered for a second, his eyes pleading with Lydia for a forgiveness she couldn't give. Then he too was gone. As soon as they were out of sight, The men on the ridge melted back into the trees as silently as they had appeared. An older man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, came down into the hollow. He and Nate spoke in their own language, their voices low and urgent. Lydia clutched her children, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. After a few moments, Nate turned to her. "That was my cousin, Blackhawk," he said. "They were on their way to our spring camp when they saw the tracks. They will stay close for now. You are safe." Safe. The word sounded foreign. She hadn't felt safe in months. But looking at Nate, at the quiet strength in his face, she started to believe it might be true. That night around the fire, the reality of her situation sank in. Martin hadn't just been framed. He had been murdered as part of a conspiracy that went all the way to the top of their town's government. And they weren't just after a ledger anymore. They were after whatever Martin had hidden in the Red Hills. "The map," she said suddenly, pulling the worn, creased piece of paper from her coat. "Martin gave this to me. He told me to come here if anything happened." She smoothed it out on a flat rock by the fire. It was a simple map showing the river, a distinctive cluster of 3 rocks, and a single large pine tree marked with an X. Nate leaned over to look at it, his expression unreadable. He studied it for a long time. "I know this place," he said finally. "It is deep in the hills. A difficult journey." "What's there?" Lydia asked, her voice a whisper. "Why would he send me there?" Nate looked up from the map, his eyes meeting hers. "That spot," he said slowly, "is an old burial ground, a sacred place for my ancestors. No one has gone there for many years." A burial ground. Why would Martin hide something in a place like that? It made no sense. Unless he wasn't hiding a thing, but a person. But that was impossible. The next morning, Lydia knew what she had to do. "I have to go," she told Nate. "I have to see what he wanted me to find." Nate was quiet for a moment. "It is dangerous," he said. "The mayor's men will be watching. They will know you will go looking for it." "I don't have a choice," Lydia insisted. "They will never leave us alone until I find it. This is the only way to end it." Nate nodded slowly. He understood. He knew what it was like to have everything taken from you. "I will go with you," he said. "Blackhawk and his family will watch over the children." They left at dawn, traveling light and moving fast. Nate led the way, his movements silent and sure-footed, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Lydia followed, her body aching, but her resolve firm. The journey was grueling, up steep, rocky inclines and through dense, thorny brush. By late afternoon they arrived. It was a small, sheltered clearing at the base of a cliff. 3 large boulders stood like ancient sentinels, and in the center of the clearing was a massive old pine tree, its bark scarred and weathered. It was exactly like the drawing on Martin's map. But there was nothing there. No sign of disturbed earth, no hidden chest, nothing. Just the quiet, eerie silence of a place long abandoned. Lydia's heart sank. Had she come all this way for nothing? Had she risked everything for a dead end? She ran her hand over the rough bark of the pine tree, her hope fading with the daylight. "There's nothing here," she said, her voice choked with disappointment. Nate didn't answer. He was walking the perimeter of the clearing, his eyes on the ground. Then he stopped. "Lydia," he said, his voice tense, "come here." She walked over to where he was standing, near the base of the cliff face. He was pointing at something on the ground. It was a carving in the rock, almost completely obscured by moss and dirt. It was a symbol she didn't recognize. "It is a marker," Nate said. "From my people. It means sanctuary." He ran his hands over the rock face, pushing aside a thick curtain of ivy, and behind it there was a dark opening, a cave. Her heart pounding, Lydia followed Nate into the darkness. It was a small cave, just big enough for a person to shelter in. And in the back, huddled under a pile of old furs, was a man. He was old and frail, with a long white beard and eyes that were wide with fear. But as he looked up at her, Lydia gasped. She knew him. It was Mr. Abernathy, the old land surveyor from Dalton. He had been Martin's friend, a kind old man who had disappeared without a trace a week before Martin was arrested. Everyone thought he had just packed up and left town. "Mr. Abernathy," Lydia whispered in disbelief. The old man's eyes filled with tears. Lydia, he croaked, his voice weak from disuse. Martin, he saved me. He found out the mayor was going to kill me because I knew about the land fraud. He brought me here, told me to wait. He said he would come back for me. Lydia knelt beside him, her mind reeling. The ledger wasn't a book. It was a person, a living witness to the mayor's crimes. Martin hadn't been trying to save a piece of paper. He had been trying to save a life. But as the relief washed over her, a new cold dread took its place. Mr. Abernathy was alive. He was the proof she needed. But he was also the one thing the mayor and his men would stop at nothing to destroy. And now they had led them right to him. A sound from the mouth of the cave made them all freeze. A rock skittering down the cliff face. They weren't alone. The sheriff and his men had followed them. They were trapped in the cave with the one man who could bring the whole conspiracy crashing down. And the hunters were closing in. The silence in the cave was absolute. Lydia could hear her own heart thundering in her ears. Outside, another rock tumbled. Closer this time. They were being careful. They were searching. Mr. Abernathy was shaking, his eyes wide with terror. They found me, he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. They're going to kill me. Nate put a hand on the old man's shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. They will not get past me, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He drew the long knife from his belt, the steel glinting in the faint light filtering into the cave. He was calm, his face set like stone, but Lydia could see the coiled tension in his muscles. He was ready to fight. He was ready to die to protect them. But Lydia knew that wasn't enough. There were at least 3 of them out there, all armed with guns. Nate was skilled, but he couldn't fight them all. She had to think. Martin had a plan. He wouldn't have just left Mr. Abernathy here to be found. There had to be something else. She looked around the small cave, her eyes scanning every rock and crevice. Her gaze fell on a pile of loose rocks in the far corner. It looked like a recent rockfall, but the stones were piled too neatly, too deliberately. Nate, she whispered, pointing, help me. Together they started pulling the rocks away. Behind them was another opening, a narrow dark tunnel, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. It was an escape route. Martin had found a way out. Mr. Abernathy, Lydia said, turning to the old man, you have to go. Now. Follow this tunnel. Don't stop. The old surveyor looked at the dark opening, then back at Lydia, his face filled with fear. I can't, he stammered. I'm too old, too weak. You must, Nate said firmly. Lydia will go with you. I will hold them off. No, Lydia said, grabbing his arm. I'm not leaving you. You must, he insisted, his dark eyes boring into hers. The children need you. You must take him to Black Hawk. They will get him to safety. Voices echoed from outside the cave entrance, closer now. Check in here. It was the sheriff's voice. They were out of time. Lydia looked at Nate, at the fierce determination in his face. She knew he was right. Arguing would only get them all killed. I will come back for you, she promised, her voice thick with unshed tears. Nate gave her a rare small smile. I will be waiting, he said. He pushed her toward the tunnel. Now go! Lydia helped a trembling Mr. Abernathy to his feet and guided him into the narrow passage. She gave Nate one last, desperate look, and then she plunged into the darkness after the old man. The tunnel was claustrophobic and pitch black. It smelled of damp earth and decay. They stumbled forward, their hands scraping against the rough rock walls. Behind them, Lydia heard the sheriff's men enter the main cave. There were shouts of surprise, then Nate's voice, low and challenging. Then a gunshot. The sound echoed through the tunnel, and Lydia's heart stopped. Another gunshot followed, and then another. Then a terrible, guttural scream of pain. Lydia stifled a sob, forcing herself to keep moving, pushing Mr. Abernathy forward. She couldn't think about Nate. She couldn't let herself believe the worst. She had to get Mr. Abernathy to safety. It was the only thing that mattered. The tunnel twisted and turned, sloping downwards. After what felt like an eternity, she saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. They scrambled toward it, emerging from a small hole at the bottom of the ravine, hidden by a thicket of bushes. They were out. They were free. But as Lydia looked back up at the cliffs, she saw them. The sheriff and one of his men, standing at the mouth of the cave, looking down into the ravine. They hadn't seen them yet, but they would. And then she saw something else, something that made her blood run cold. The smirking man, the one with the knife, was lying on the ground at the cave entrance. He wasn't moving, but there was no sign of Nate. Had he been captured? Or was he? No. She couldn't think it. The sheriff shouted something and pointed down into the ravine. They had been spotted. Lydia grabbed Mr. Abernathy's arm and pulled him into the trees, running blindly, stumbling over rocks and roots. She could hear the men crashing through the undergrowth behind them, getting closer. They were going to be caught. They had come so far, only to fail at the very end. Just as the sheriff's heavy footsteps sounded right behind her, a war cry erupted from the trees all around them. Black Hawk and his warriors emerged from the forest, arrows flying. The sheriff's remaining thug went down with a surprised grunt, an arrow in his chest. The sheriff himself yelped in pain as an arrow thudded into his shoulder, and he dropped his gun, stumbling to his knees. It was over in seconds. The woods fell silent again. Black Hawk stood over the wounded sheriff, his face grim. Lydia leaned against a tree, gasping for breath, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. They were safe. Mr. Abernathy was safe. But as the adrenaline faded, one thought consumed her. Nate. She turned to Black Hawk, her eyes wild with desperation. Nate, she choked out, is he? Black Hawk's expression was solemn. He shook his head slowly. He fought bravely, he said. He took one of them down, but the other one, the sheriff, he shot him. Nate fell from the cliff. Fell. The word was a death sentence. Lydia's world shattered. He was gone. The man who had saved her, who had delivered her son, who had become her anchor in the storm, was gone. She had come back, just as she had promised. But he wasn't there to be waiting for her. He was gone forever. And as she crumpled to the ground, a wave of grief and despair washing over her, she knew that even if they won, even if the mayor was brought to justice, she had already lost the thing that mattered most. The days that followed were a blur of grief. Black Hawk and his people took Lydia, her children, and Mr. Abernathy back to their camp, deep in the mountains where no one would find them. The old surveyor, safe at last, told his story to Black Hawk, who promised to take it to the territorial governor. Justice would be served. The mayor and his corrupt cronies would pay for their crimes. Lydia's name would be cleared forever, but none of it mattered. With Nate gone, the world felt gray and empty. She would sit by the fire for hours, rocking Luke, her mind replaying her last moments with Nate over and over again. His quiet smile, his promise to be waiting, a promise that was now broken forever. One morning, Hazel came to her, tugging on her sleeve. In her small hand, she held one of the wooden carvings Nate had made, the little horse. Nate, she said, her little voice filled with a child's simple certainty. Nate, come back. Lydia's heart broke all over again. No, sweetie, she whispered, pulling her daughter into her arms. Nate's not coming back. But Hazel shook her head stubbornly. He promised, she insisted. Lydia didn't have the heart to argue. She just held her daughter and cried silent tears. Weeks turned into a month. The leaves on the trees began to turn brilliant shades of red and gold. Autumn had arrived. A rider came to the camp one day, a messenger from the governor. Mr. Abernathy's testimony, combined with the capture of the wounded sheriff, had been enough. Mayor Thompson and his men had been arrested. The whole corrupt enterprise had been exposed. The messenger had brought a letter for Lydia. It was an official apology from the territorial government, and a deed, the deed to the land in the hollow, Red Earth Hollow. It was hers now, legally, officially, a small measure of justice, but it felt like a hollow victory. Lydia decided it was time to leave. She couldn't stay in the mountains forever, and she couldn't go back to Dalton. The hollow was the only home she had left. It would be painful to return, to see all the reminders of Nate, but it was where she belonged. Black Hawk agreed to escort her. They packed their few belongings, and with heavy hearts, they began the journey back. When they arrived at the hollow, it was just as they had left it. The small cabin stood sturdy and waiting. The fire pit was cold. The silence was deafening. Lydia walked through the small clearing, touching the log where they had sat, the doorframe of the home they had built together. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing her breath. She spent the next few days in a daze going through the motions of survival. She tended to the children, gathered firewood, and tried not to look at the empty space across the fire where Nate used to sit. One afternoon, she was cleaning out the cabin when she found something tucked away on a high shelf. It was the first carving Nate had been working on when she met him, the one he had set aside. It was unfinished, but she could see the shape of it. It was a hawk, its wings outstretched as if in flight. And carved into the base, in small, rough letters, was a single word: Lydia. Her breath caught in her throat. He had been carving it for her. All this time, she clutched the wooden hawk to her chest, a fresh wave of grief washing over her. That evening, as she sat outside watching the sunset paint the red hills in fiery colors, she saw a movement at the edge of the trees. Her first thought was fear. Had some of the mayor's men escaped? She grabbed Hazel and backed toward the cabin door. But then the figure stepped out into the clearing. He was thin, gaunt even, and he leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch. His arm was in a sling, and he had a long, ugly scar down the side of his face. But it was him. It was Nate. Lydia stood frozen, unable to believe her eyes. It was impossible. He was dead. He had fallen. "Nate," she whispered, the name a prayer on her lips. He gave her a weak, tired smile. "I told you I would be waiting," he said, his voice raspy. He had fallen, but the fall hadn't killed him. He had landed in a deep snowdrift at the bottom of the ravine, his fall cushioned. His arm was broken, and he had been badly wounded, but he was alive. One of Black Hawk's hunting parties had found him days later, barely conscious, and had nursed him back to health in a hidden camp. He had been getting his strength back, waiting until he was strong enough to make the journey home. Home. He had come home. Lydia ran to him, tears streaming down her face, and threw her arms around him. He was real. He was warm. He was alive. Hazel ran to him, too, wrapping her little arms around his legs. "Nate, come back!" she squealed with delight. Luke, in Lydia's arms, reached out a chubby hand and touched Nate's face. That night, they sat by the fire, a family reunited. The hollow was no longer silent and empty. It was filled with laughter and hope. Nate told her about his recovery, and she told him about the mayor's arrest. The long nightmare was finally over. Lydia looked at the man beside her, the man who had faced death for her and her children. She looked at her son, sleeping peacefully in his cradle, and her daughter curled up at Nate's side, listening to him tell a story in his low, quiet voice. She had lost everything, and then she had found it all again, here, in this small, sheltered hollow. This was her home. This was her family. And this time she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would never have to run again. Folks, life has a funny way of working out. Sometimes you have to go through the deepest, darkest valleys to find your way to the sunlit peak. Lydia Mercer was cast out, left for dead, and hunted by evil men. But she never gave up. She found strength she never knew she had, and love in the most unexpected of places. Her story is a reminder that even when things seem hopeless, there's always a chance for a new beginning. It's about courage, resilience, and the family you choose. Thank you for sticking with me through this incredible journey. If you were moved by Lydia and Nate's story, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel out. And if you want more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single one. Let me know in the comments below what part of this story hit you the hardest. I read every single one. Until next time, stay safe out there and never, ever lose hope.